the resident of Sector 4. In the heart of Orizon, a city that pulsed with neon perfection, there existed a world beneath the floorboards. This was the realm of Sector 4, a labyrinth of humming servers and cold steel. Here, the air tasted of ozone and static electricity, and the only sound was the rhythmic whirring of cooling fans. To the engineers above, this was just infrastructure. To a scruffy calico cat named Static, it was home. Static was a patchwork of survival. His fur was a chaotic blend of orange, black, and white, matted from the dampness of the vents. He carried the scars of a life lived on the edge, a notched ear from a fight with a drone and a missing tail that had been caught in a closing blast door years ago. He was a creature of the shadows, a living anomaly in a city that demanded absolute order. The people of Orizon did not like anomalies. They viewed the stray as a system error, a biological nuisance that threatened the sterile cleanliness of their high-tech paradise. Security guards were programmed to shoo him away, and residents often threw discarded tech scraps at him to keep him from the lobby. Static learned early on that visibility was a death sentence. Despite the hostility, Static was a master of his environment. He knew which pipes ran hot and which grills provided a view of the world he was forbidden to join. He moved with a silent, limping grace, his bright green eyes acting as lanterns in the dark. He was the ghost of the machine, a silent observer of a civilization that had forgotten how to be soft. Every night, he would crouch inside the metallic air vents, looking down at the glowing servers below. Fiber optic cables pulsed with light like the veins of a digital titan. The warm orange glow of the hardware provided the only heat he knew, contrasting sharply against the cold, blue-tinted steel of his hiding spots. He didn't know why he stayed. Perhaps it was the warmth, or perhaps it was the strange, magnetic pull of the energy that powered the city. Regardless, Static was the unofficial guardian of the grid. He knew the rhythm of the city better than any algorithm, and he felt the tiny tremors of the earth long before the sensors ever tripped the silent architect. Deep within the core of the city sat the office of Dr. Aris, a man who had traded his youth for the advancement of Orizon's AI. His office was a sanctuary of organized chaos, filled with blue holographic schematics that floated in the air like ghostly blueprints. Aris was the architect of the city's brain, yet he spent his nights in total isolation. Static found comfort in the doctor's presence. Through the ventilation grill high on the wall, the cat would watch the old man work. Aris was different from the others. He didn't shout or throw things. He moved with a heavy, tired slowness that Static recognized. They were both relics, one biological, one intellectual, waiting for the world to move on without them. The bond began with a saucer of milk. One evening, Aris had looked up from his desk and caught the glint of green eyes in the shadows of the vent. Instead of calling maintenance, he simply smiled and placed a small dish of milk on the floor beneath the intake fan. He didn't say a word, but the gesture was a pact of friendship that required no language. Over time, Aris began to talk to the shadows. He would explain his theories on neural mapping and quantum stability as if the cat could understand the math. Static would sit perfectly still, his ears twitching at the sound of the human voice. It was the only kindness the cat had ever known, a fragile bridge between two lonely souls. The lab was a place of cinematic quiet. The warm glow of a single desk lamp fought against the clinical, cold blue lighting of the laboratory. To Static, the man was a source of warmth more valuable than any server rack. He began to associate the scent of the doctor's tobacco and old paper with safety, a concept he had rarely encountered in the wild. Dangerously mechanical. Static stood at the edge of the server rack, his green eyes wide and reflecting the red pulse. He could feel the tension in the air, a pressure building up like a storm before the first crack of thunder. He looked at Aris, who remained slumped over his desk, and knew that the silent architect was in the direct path of the coming explosion. Chapter 4: The Sleep of Reason. Dr. Aris was dreaming of a city that could breathe. In his sleep, he was young again, walking through parks that weren't made of plastic. He didn't hear the screeching of the straining cables or the frantic meowing of the cat. His exhaustion was a heavy cloak, pulling him deeper into a slumber that threatened to become permanent. Static leaped from the rack to the floor, his landing nearly silent. He ran to the desk, his claws clicking against the metal. He hissed at the holographic schematics, which were now flashing "critical failure" in silent, glowing letters. The room was bathed in a rhythmic, hellish red light that pulsed like a dying star. The cat tried to reach the doctor's arm, but he was too small, and the desk was too high. He paced the floor, his breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. The temperature in the room had risen by 10 degrees in as many minutes. The glass walls of the lab were beginning to fog from the sudden shift in humidity. Cables beneath the floor began to vibrate so violently that the pens on Aris's desk started to rattle. Static looked at the old man's face, so peaceful and unaware. The contrast between the cinematic disaster mood of the room and the quiet stillness of the sleeping scientist was a tragic tableau. Static realized that the intelligent building was not going to save them. The automated fire suppression had been disabled for maintenance, and the emergency overrides were locked behind a physical lever on the other side of the room. The cat was the only conscious being left in a room filled with failing gods. He looked at the ventilatio grill, his usual escape route. He could leave. He could slip back into the dark and find a new basement, a new server to keep him warm. But he looked back at the man who had shared his milk and his secrets. For the first time in his life, the stray cat chose to stay and fight the warning. Static leaped onto the desk with a desperate, clumsy force. He was no longer the graceful shadow, he was a frantic blur of orange and black. He began knocking things over, pencils, tablets, and finally, a heavy ceramic mug. The mug shattered mid-air in a spray of cold coffee and porcelain, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet lab. Aris stirred, his eyelids fluttering, but he didn't wake. The smoke was beginning to curl from the floorboards now, a thin, acrid ribbon of grey. Static's expression was one of pure, wide-eyed desperation. He bit the doctor's sleeve, tugging with all his strength, but his small weight was not enough to move the man. The lighting in the room had shifted to a cinematic nightmare. The warm desk lamp had finally flickered out, leaving only the cold, pulsing red of the emergency lights. Shadows danced across the walls, looking like reaching hands. The shallow depth of field in the smoke-filled room made everything but the cat's face a blur of chaos. Static turned his attention to the primary power cable that ran along the wall. It was glowing a faint, angry red, and sparks were beginning to flicker from the joints. He knew this was the source. He understood with an animal's instinct that if this cable didn't stop vibrating, the room would soon be an inferno. He let out a long, haunting howl, a sound that was half scream, half sob. It was a sound no cat should make, a vocalization of pure terror. It vibrated through the small room, competing with the hum of the failing machinery. Yet, the scientist remained trapped in his deep, oxygen-deprived sleep. The cat stood on the edge of the desk, looking at the vibrating cable. He knew the danger. He had seen what electricity did to the rats in the basement. But he also knew that the emergency dampener was triggered by a physical break in that specific line. He took a final breath of the smoky air and prepared to do the impossible into the inferno. The crawl space beneath the main console was a forest of high-voltage wires and humming transformers. To enter it now was to walk into a furnace. Static didn't hesitate. He squeezed his scruffy body through the narrow gap, his fur brushing against hot metal that made his skin crawl. The heat distortion here was so thick it was hard to see. The air was a shimmering haze of blue and orange. Static moved toward the thick vibrating power cable that was the heart of the failure. It was glowing like a bar of forged steel, casting a terrifying light onto his determined face. Every instinct told him to run. His whiskers were trembling, and his notched ear felt like it was curling from the heat. The low-angle perspective from the cat's point of view made the cable look like a massive, glowing serpent. It hissed and spat sparks, each one a tiny explosion that threatened to ignite his fur. The tension in the framing of the room was palpable. Above him, he could hear the structural supports of the lab beginning to groan. The entire Sector 4 was on the brink of a catastrophic meltdown. Static reached the cable, his green eyes fixed on the point where the insulation had already melted away. He felt the hum of the power through his pores. It was a vibration that shook his very bones. He took a tentative step forward, his singed fur smoking slightly. There was no one to record this moment, no cameras to capture the heroism of a glitch. There was only a cat and a cable in a forgotten corner of a dying city. Static crouched, his muscles tensing for the final move. He looked up through the floorboards one last time, seeing the silhouette of the sleeping doctor. In that moment, the stray cat was the most important being in Orizon. He was the only thing standing between a peaceful retirement and a fiery grave, the final connection. Static lunged. He didn't just bite, he threw his entire body into the task. His teeth sank into the glowing sensor cable, not the main power line, which would have vaporized him instantly, but the thin, critical sensor lead that controlled the magnetic dampeners. The world exploded in a spray of electrical sparks. The cinematic slow-motion style of the moment captured the fur singeing on his shoulders and the sparks frozen mid-air like diamonds of fire. An intense jolt of electricity surged through him, locking his jaw and clouding his vision with white light. The lighting shifted to an intense, heroic red and blue. Static felt a pain unlike anything he had ever known, but he didn't let go. He was a circuit breaker made of flesh and bone. The cable snapped under his weight and the force of the surge, the two ends whipping away like angry snakes. As the connection broke, a signal was finally sent to the city's ancient mechanical overrides. The smart system had been bypassed by a physical act of sacrifice. Above him, the sound of the world changed. The frantic humming stopped, replaced by a deep, industrial thud that shook the foundation of the tower. Static was thrown backward by the final discharge. He hit the cold steel wall of the crawl space and slumped to the floor, his body smoking. The red warning lights began to dim, their angry pulse slowing down as the energy was diverted into the safety buffers. He lay in the dark, his breathing shallow and ragged. The air was finally beginning to cool as the steam erupted from the emergency vents. He had done it. The glitch had corrected the system. He closed his eyes, the smell of burnt hair and ozone lingering in his nose as he drifted into a heavy, silent darkness. The containment. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a drum. Massive mechanical dampening rods, 20 feet of solid tungsten, slammed down into the glowing energy core. The energy didn't just stop, it collapsed in on itself with a cinematic roar of industrial power. Steam erupted from every vent in Sector 4, a white shroud that hid the damage. The epic sci-fi disaster had been contained, not by an algorithm, but by a pound of biological courage. The emergency lights transitioned from a panicked red to a steady, calm amber. Dr. Aris finally jolted awake. The sound of the dampening rods had succeeded where the cat's cries had failed. He coughed as the white steam filled his lungs, his eyes darting around the smoke-filled lab. Static, he wheezed, his first thought not for the millions of dollars of equipment, but for the ghost in the vents. He saw the shattered mug and the scorched floorboards. He saw that system secure message on his monitors, a status that should have been impossible. Aris stumbled to the crawl space opening, his hands trembling as he pulled back the charred paneling. There, in the emotional silence of the dying embers, he found the cat. Static lay motionless, a small pile of scorched fur and soot. The tragic framing of the scene, the tiny hero beside the massive, dead cable, was enough to break the heart of the man who had built the city. Aris reached in, his fingers brushing against the cat's singed side. He expected to feel the coldness of death, but instead, he felt a faint, rhythmic throb. Static was still fighting. The scientist gathered the cat to his chest, his tears leaving tracks through the soot on his own face. The recovery. The dawn didn't come with a bang, but with a soft, hopeful glow. Static woke up on a heated veterinary pad, the kind of luxury he had only ever seen through glass windows. An oxygen tube was draped near his nose, providing a cool, clean breeze that tasted of life. His muzzle was slightly scorched, and his whiskers were gone, but his green eyes were half open and clear. The lighting in the room was peaceful, a soft sunrise glow that promised a new day. He was no longer in the dark basement of Sector 4, he was in a place of white linens and soft voices. Dr. Aris was there, sitting in a chair by the bed. He looked older, but there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He reached out and gently stroked the one ear that wasn't bandaged. "You did it, you old glitch," he whispered. "You saved us all." The news of the hero cat of Orizon had spread through the city. The citizens who had once thrown stones now sent boxes of high-grade salmon and silk blankets. That system error had become a symbol of something the city had lost, the idea that every life, no matter how scruffy, had a vital role to play. Static felt the warmth of the pad beneath him. For the first time, he didn't have to keep one eye open for drones or security guards. He let out a low, raspy purr, a sound that vibrated through the quiet room. It was a song of recovery, an emotional hope that resonated with everyone who heard it. He wasn't a stray anymore. He was a resident. The man who had built the city and the cat who had saved it were no longer relics of the past, they were the foundation of a new kind of future for Orizon, one that valued the heart as much as the hardware, the legacy of the stray. Years later, a visitor to Orizon might notice something unusual in the lobby of the central tower. Beside the emergency lever, the one that had been triggered by a cat's bite, stands a small bronze statue. It depicts a calico cat with a notched ear and a missing tail, looking up with determined green eyes. The statue is often bathed in a soft beam of light, a symbolic and emotional tribute to the day the machines failed. It is a cinematic composition that reminds every passerby that perfection is a myth, but bravery is real. Children often touch the bronze ear for luck before they head up to the city. Static himself spent his final years in a country house far from the chrome of the city. He lived in a world of sunlight through windows and the smell of real grass. He could often be found curled on the lap of an elderly man, both of them content to watch the world go by from a porch swing. The colors of his life had changed from cold blue and neon red to the warm, cozy oranges of a fireplace. He was no longer a ghost in the vents, he was a legend in the sunlight. His missing tail was no longer a mark of shame, but a badge of a life fully lived. On his final evening, Static sat calmly on a windowsill overlooking the city at dawn. His silhouette was heroic against the rising sun, the warm colors reflecting in his green eyes. He looked out at the towers of Orizon, knowing that the heart of the city was beating because of him. This is the story of Static, a reminder that you are never too small, too broken, or too imperfect to change the world. If Static's journey touched your heart, hit the like button and subscribe to Paws that saved lives. Tell us in the comments, who is that Static in your life? Let's honor the silent heroes together.